There are athletes who win titles. There are athletes who break records. And then there are athletes whose bodies become monuments to obsession. Ronnie Coleman was not just a champion bodybuilder. He became a living experiment in how far the human frame could be pushed before it finally began collapsing under its own greatness. By the time the world truly understood what his body had endured, the trophies had already been collected, the crowds had already screamed his name, and the damage had already become permanent. Because the truth about Ronnie Coleman was never only about muscle. It was about sacrifice, and eventually survival. The story begins long before the surgeries, long before the wheelchairs, the crutches, the hospital beds, and the infections. It begins in a small gym where pain was treated like background noise and heavy weight was treated like religion. In the late 1990s, bodybuilding was entering a new era. The sport already had legends. Men like Flex Wheeler, Kevin Levrone, and Sean Ray had physiques people thought represented the peak of human development. Symmetry, conditioning, proportions, aesthetics, those were the standards. Then Ronnie Coleman arrived and changed the scale entirely. When he stepped on stage at the 1998 Mr. Olympia in New York, he looked impossible. Not just big, not just lean. Impossible. At nearly 300 pounds on stage, he carried the kind of muscle mass that should never have looked that sharp under stage lighting. His back looked carved from granite. His legs looked engineered rather than trained. Competitors standing beside him suddenly appeared smaller than they actually were. And from that moment, bodybuilding changed forever. From 1998 through 2005, Ronnie Coleman won 8 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, tying the all-time record previously held by Lee Haney. Every year he came back larger, denser, and somehow even more conditioned. Fans called him the king. Others called him superhuman. Some simply called him insane. Because unlike many bodybuilders who trained carefully to preserve longevity, Ronnie trained as though longevity did not matter. The videos from Metroflex Gym became legendary. 800-pound squats, 800-pound deadlifts, dumbbells heavier than some people's body weight, leg presses stacked with plates until the machine itself looked close to snapping. And the terrifying part was not just the weight, it was the way he moved it. No hesitation, no fear. Just aggression. Yeah, buddy. Lightweight, baby. The phrases became iconic, but hidden behind the energy was something darker, a mindset that refused to acknowledge physical limitation. At the time, people saw motivation. Years later, doctors saw destruction. Because the human spine is not designed to repeatedly absorb that level of force for decades, especially not an already injured spine. Long before the world knew Ronnie Coleman as Mr. Olympia, his back had already been damaged. As a teenager, he suffered injuries while powerlifting. Later, while playing football at Grambling State University, the problems worsened. But pain never stopped him. Pain became routine, and that routine eventually turned catastrophic. One training session in the mid-1990s changed everything. Ronnie was squatting hundreds of pounds for reps when he suddenly heard a pop in his lower back. Not discomfort, not soreness, a pop. Most people would have stopped immediately. Ronnie finished the workout. That single decision would quietly shape the rest of his life. Medical scans later revealed a severe disc injury. Doctors recommended surgery and significant recovery time. They warned him that continuing to train heavily could create long-term spinal damage. Ronnie ignored them, not because he did not understand the risk, because, to him, stopping felt worse than injury. He had spent years fighting for recognition, years balancing bodybuilding with police work in Texas, years traveling cheaply to competitions with almost no money. He believed he had finally reached the doorstep of greatness, and greatness in his mind demanded everything. So instead of months of recovery, he rested briefly and returned to training. Not light training, heavy training, and over the next decade his spine slowly began losing the war. Every squat compressed damaged discs further. Every deadlift increased instability. Every year added more wear to structures already failing underneath the muscle. But while the damage worsened internally, externally Ronnie Coleman appeared unbeatable. That is what made the situation so dangerous. The bodybuilders around him saw dominance. Fans saw invincibility. The cameras saw perfection. Only his spine knew the truth. By the mid-2000s, the consequences were becoming impossible to hide. Walking became painful. Nerve compression caused severe burning sensations through his legs. Certain movements became difficult even outside the gym. Still, he trained, because by then, training was no longer simply preparation for competition. It was identity. Athletes often struggle when retirement approaches because they fear losing purpose. For Ronnie Coleman, that fear was magnified. The gym had become the center of his entire existence. And then, eventually, the body forced a decision he would never have made voluntarily. After retiring from professional competition, the surgeries began. At first, the procedures seemed manageable. A spinal surgery here, a decompression there. Doctors attempted to relieve pressure on nerves damaged by years of compression and degeneration. But spinal surgeries are rarely simple, especially when multiple levels of the spine are involved. One operation led to another, then another, then another. Metal rods were inserted, screws anchored vertebrae together. Artificial supports replaced structures that had been destroyed over years of extreme loading. His hips eventually failed as well, leading to replacements on both sides. And yet even after major surgeries, Ronnie often returned to the gym, not to compete anymore, just because he could not stay away. That refusal to detach from heavy lifting became one of the most debated parts of his story. Some admired the dedication. Others believed it accelerated the damage even further. Doctors reviewing his case publicly explained how repeated high-force compression can weaken hardware over time. When fused sections of the spine lose natural flexibility, stress transfers into surrounding areas. In Ronnie's case, that stress became relentless. Several screws reportedly broke inside his back over the years, requiring revision surgeries to repair the damage. Hardware meant to stabilize the spine instead became part of an ongoing cycle of complications. The physical toll was brutal. Walking assistance became necessary. Muscle atrophy developed in his legs from nerve damage. Simple movements became difficult. For a man once considered the most powerful bodybuilder alive, even standing upright could become exhausting. And yet, through all of it, Ronnie Coleman rarely spoke with bitterness. That is one of the strangest parts of his story. Even after years of pain, he often smiled through interviews, joked with fans, and continued appearing at expos around the world. He spoke openly about regret in some areas, but never regret about working hard. To him, the titles had cost something enormous, but they were still worth winning. Then came the summer of 2025, and suddenly the conversation was no longer about mobility or surgeries. It became about survival. Reports emerged that Ronnie Coleman had been hospitalized in critical condition after developing severe sepsis linked to an infection. The situation escalated rapidly. Sepsis is not just an infection. It is the body entering systemic crisis while attempting to fight one. Organs begin struggling, blood pressure collapses. The immune response itself becomes dangerous. For someone with extensive surgical history and reduced mobility, the risks become even greater. According to public updates from his family, the infection spread aggressively. Ronnie required intensive medical care, including procedures connected to complications affecting his heart. For a period, the situation became extremely serious. Fans around the world feared the worst. Social media filled with tributes, prayers, and old training clips. People who had grown up watching his legendary workouts suddenly realized that the giant they viewed as indestructible was, in fact, painfully human. Eventually, positive news arrived. He survived. But the incident revealed how fragile the situation had become behind the scenes. The body that once handled unimaginable punishment inside the gym was now fighting basic biological crises simply to stay alive. And maybe that is the real ending to the Ronnie Coleman story. Not the trophies, not the records, not even the surgeries, but the price. Because Ronnie Coleman achieved something almost nobody else ever has. He built a physique so extraordinary that decades later people still compare every mass monster to him. But history remembers greatness. It does not always show the damage required to create it. The screaming joints, the compressed nerves, the sleepless nights, the surgeries, the infections, the years spent relearning how to walk. Those things rarely appear beside the trophies, yet they are part of the same story. Today, Ronnie Coleman remains one of the most respected figures in bodybuilding history. Younger athletes still study his training footage with disbelief. Fans still quote his legendary gym phrases. His name still represents the absolute extreme edge of bodybuilding intensity. But his body also became a warning. A reminder that the human frame has limits, even when the mind refuses to accept them. Because in the end, Ronnie Coleman did not lose because he was weak. He suffered because he was willing to push further than almost anyone ever would. And for 8 years on the Olympia stage, that willingness made him untouchable. But afterward, the bill finally arrived.